Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon. I'm in New York, so it's afternoon here. Ryan mentioned we'll have a Q&A session at the end, and I'm happy to answer any questions, or if you'd like to follow up, you'll get my email address as well. We try to do these webinars about once a month or so, and really enjoy the interaction with people that attend. So just to start things off, it may be worthwhile to kind of explain a bit about who we are. We're a cybersecurity product and services company. Our products are fundamentally intended to protect organizations from the threat of advanced malware using a very complex and yet easy to use technology that identifies advanced malware by mathematical formulas. We've got associated services for research, as well as, of course, product sales and implementation. We can assist with forensics and incident response. So I'm sure everyone is familiar with the history of XP. It was released in 2001 and at the end of 2001. So for the last 12 years, it's been actively used, and as of today, it's still in use by some estimates in as much as 75% of all Windows computers between personal and corporate IT estates. The composition of that use is roughly reported as about 95% of the world's automated teller machines. Coincidentally, about 90% of the point of service or sales terminals that serve financial services, retail, and healthcare space. In healthcare IT estates, it's estimated to be currently in use on about 60% of the global managed estates. About 30% of the industrial control systems that manage programmable logic controllers and provide interfaces for remote terminal units and bridges for communications with industrial control systems are running on XP, or have applications running on XP for that management. And more generally, about 20% of other critical infrastructure, largely related with transportation management and logistics. Windows reached end of life, Windows XP, on April 8th. However, there is an extended support for Windows Embedded, which goes through the end of December 2016 for some components, and through the end of January 2017 for other components of the embedded support. In the meantime, Microsoft is continuing to offer paid-for support for customers that need to or want to continue to use XP. In some cases, XP can't be upgraded, but we'll talk about that, and we'll talk about some of the reasons and some of the concerns. To get a little better understanding of the breadth of its use, you can use public resources, such as you see here, Shodan, could provide a quick intel crawl across the internet for systems that have previously been reported and recorded as running on XP and their different protocols. For example, on the left side here on the screen, you can see that there's some Modbus building management or other type of industrial control systems being managed on Windows XP that are easily determined by public records. Of course, you're all, I'm sure, familiar with Windows XP logos on ATMs when you go to withdraw money, or as happened to me yesterday in Boston when I was at the Amtrak station to print my ticket. Unfortunately, the kiosk that I was printing my ticket from was in the process of rebooting, and so I snapped a quick picture of the actual terminal on April 9th, the day after the XP end of life. There have been some 726 publicly reported vulnerabilities on the CVE tracker This doesn't include the most recent 4 that were reported in the last 2 days, though. Generally, these span 3 different vulnerabilities areas that attackers leverage to gain access to systems. Fundamentally, there are 3 types of exploits that they conduct. Exploits to bypass security controls in order to then gain privileged access for the purposes of then executing their code, either in memory or with a file, such as malware. The techniques vary from hacker techniques such as cross-site scripting or SQL injection to more advanced techniques such as buffer overflows or memory corruption attacks that leverage either, again, either existing files or inject, as they call it, arbitrary code for execution. The dispersion of the vulnerabilities that have been reported on the CVEs is shown here from the chart that was taken right off of the CVE details website. Fundamentally, the kill chain, as we call it, hasn't changed. I show some books here that my friend and colleague Stu has authored over the years, the Hacking Exposed series. And the image on the right here is the anatomy of the hack, or the kill chain, from the first edition. And it really hasn't changed throughout all of the editions. It's still fundamentally the same. There are 3 types of activity, or three basic requirements required to hack a system. And fundamentally, you need some kind of tool to access the system, whether that's tools that the system provides itself through weak configurations of web services, tools that are leveraged such as Metasploit to exploit configuration anomalies, or tools that are dropped by user behavior such as a phishing or waterhole visit. Next to the tools that provide the access to the system, fundamental requirement is some kind of credential to use the system, either through impersonation or through the use of previously stolen or stolen for purpose credentials. And then fundamentally, an attacker needs time to do it. The reason I point these 3 fundamentals out is they provide indicators. They're attributes to system compromise, attributes to the hacking activities that if you perceive the activities by their fundamental requirements of tools, credentials, and time, then you can look for the indicators to identify the systems that have been compromised with which tools and credentials to understand the impact on an organization. Speaking of exploits, there's a lot of emphasis and a lot of attention, particularly in the press, around the concept of 0 days. And we like to distinguish between the types of exploits that actually exist. And this gets some reference now as more in the community adopt these distinctions. 0 days are interesting, but fundamentally people don't know about them because they're used by the people that create them. However, once those 0 days are used on a system, they then become what we call a half day at some point, because more people become aware of the exploits that are being leveraged, either because of researchers or automated tools that discover the related files or the related code execution techniques. And so fundamentally they become discovered, and upon discovery they're called half days. The difference between a 0 day and a half day is that a half day, some people at least know about them, and there may even be public Metasploits developed, but there aren't actually any patches yet available from vendors to correct the issue. The difference between a half day and a single day is a single day is an exploit that people know about. It's been published about. They may or are being used by varied threat actors around the world, and patches exist to remediate them. but sometimes those patches can't be applied because of version inconsistencies with other tools, or they just simply have not yet been applied, either because they need to go through a structured change management testing program as a process of the organization's IT controls, or for one reason or another they've not yet been applied. Unfortunately, often the issue with single days is process deficiencies in IT management sometimes cause gaps in things like the configuration management database or asset management database, and organizations often lose track of some of their IT assets. And in our investigations and response activities on breaches, we commonly come across systems that have been compromised, for which there are patches available that would have protected those systems, but simply because they're no longer in an AMDB or a CMDB, the organization isn't aware procedurally of the existence of the systems, even though the attackers are. So single days, actually, in the span of the vulnerabilities that are exploited in the breach cases that we work, represent the biggest actual risk to the organizations that we've provided services and support to. XP is actually reaching a point now, since its end of life, where it's going to structurally converge into what's called a forever day, though. Forever days are exploits, as it says, of vulnerabilities that can't be patched because there's no technical patch available, or a technical patch can't be created, and it requires simply a replacement. In some cases, though, the replacement may not be possible. For example, in certain parts of critical infrastructure, it may mean taking down an entire oil platform or an entire gas pipeline or power distribution grid. And it sounds sensational to say that, but it's actually factual. And so there's a business cost that has to be evaluated, and some companies weigh those risks and the related costs with associated reference to the question of, is there even a replacement available? In many cases, particularly where XP is still being used, or even older versions of Windows such as 2000 and NT in critical infrastructure, they're being used simply because the software that operates those systems has not been upgraded, in some cases because the companies that created it and the developers themselves are no longer accessible to provide upgrades. They've gone out of business, or systems have moved on. And unfortunately, there are inconsistencies between operating platforms, even in a family like Windows, such that there is sometimes not backward compatibility with later versions of operating systems to transfer applications, even in virtual containers, to later versions of the operating system. So forever days are fundamentally exploits for vulnerabilities that can't be patched. Single days, as mentioned, are vulnerabilities that patches are available for, but for one reason or another, which may include technical reasons or may include operational, haven't been applied. Half days are those exploits that there are no patches yet available for, but people know about. And 0 days are those wildcards that nobody really knows about. So XP has some structural weaknesses, some architectural weaknesses. My friend Stu published a blog, I think last week, that described these in a little more detail. But basically, if you're familiar with the later versions of the Windows operating system, you'll know that many of the changes, particularly with Win 7, were focused on security weaknesses that pre-existed the Win 7 platform. Windows 2003 and particularly Windows XP, the association of the user experience to the operating system was too tight, and there weren't enough, particularly randomization factors between the two environments, if you will, to allow sandboxing of some concepts and isolation of processes from credential management. And these are practically demonstrated through this list, and this webinar, as mentioned earlier, is being recorded, so you're welcome to come back to this, download it, etc., for more detail. But as the first part, XP doesn't have support for structured exception handling, override protection, and so it makes it susceptible to buffer overflow, in which buffer overflow may reveal part of a stack that can be attacked for arbitrary code execution. XP is not compatible with protected mode and enhanced mode browsing, and so, for example, the Internet Explorer, even the later versions of Internet Explorer are not compatible with XP. I think version 8 is the most recent, and it didn't have least privilege management in the browser. XP doesn't have address space layout randomization. ASLR, although there are bypasses available for it that are relatively commonly utilized by attackers today, ASLR still provides a layer of protection by randomizing the stack and the heap itself, so that there's no general target that is always available in the stack to attack. Unfortunately, XP doesn't have that support, or has only very limited support, and so many stack attacks specifically address parts that don't change. XP doesn't have virtual table guard, and as you see, enhanced GS buffer overrun protection. So there's no heuristic checking for automated security management. As you see, compiler inserted array bound checking doesn't exist, and so on. So virtual call management is basically not handled with XP, and instead it goes to direct calls. There's no support for header encoding, termination, allocation randomization, and so on. So basically all of these come back to the stack itself, how the stack can be targeted, how it can be exploited through targeting, and fundamentally allow the in-process code execution. And then the part that I spend a lot of time talking with clients about is number 6, the lack of user account control and registry virtualization. User interface privilege isolation is a specifically valuable advantage of Win7 and Win8 that doesn't exist in XP, and this brings back the earlier point that I made, that a fundamental architectural weakness in XP is the close association between the user experience and the operating system, and that's due to a few things. One is that software that's installed on XP, for a variety of reasons, often just operational, is granted privileges that are higher in most cases than you'd like to see. So sort of by default, often the software is installed with a system-level privilege or an administrative privilege, rather than a better security policy or ACL that would give at least a logical user interface privilege isolation. XP simply doesn't have that kind of bounded discretion between the user experience and the operating system, meaning that third-party or other controls have to be implemented, whereas Win7 and Win8 have specifically included those kind of capabilities to provide a better managed security solution between the user experience and the operating system. So for XP, I like to talk about threes. Fundamentally, there are three types of attacks that can occur with XP. An attack that leverages a drop file to exploit vulnerabilities with malware, and here we're talking fundamentally about phishing or waterhole visits. An attack that injects into memory to exploit vulnerabilities and open the system to access. Here we're talking about metasploits or, again, waterholing that will then use process discovery and injection. Or an attack that uses existing tools that provide remote access services like VNC or RDP or LogMeIn or Telnet or FTP. So services that already exist, and they'll compromise service vulnerabilities or they'll use credentials that they've gained with social engineering or other means to then access the systems. It's important to think about the three different things in order to kind of conceive effective protection strategies. So using credentials is a really key focus area for security in XP. There are some well-known privilege escalation paths in XP. The most fundamental, of course, is the AT job that prior to Service Pack 3 allowed the escalation from user privilege to a superuser or system privilege, which would then allow pivoting to other systems as well as reconfiguration of the system itself. Now that was patched with Service Pack 3. However, as I'll demonstrate in a moment, it was just a patch. It wasn't actually a solution. And also, because of one of the things I mentioned a few minutes ago, discretionary ACLs are often a path of privilege escalation in XP because the software that's run on systems is unfortunately typically granted too high a privilege, and so privileges can be escalated for impersonation through weak DACLs. And then, of course, with memory injection and vulnerability exploits of the operating system and associated software, things as fundamental as LSAS, for example, the logical security access credential management system, can be stolen. So I'll show a few of these things. Now, since it's been out there for 12 years, the community, researchers, both black and white, have spent a lot of time developing and publishing exploits. There are many sites you can go to, and it's largely a point-and-click operation today to do things as fundamental as waterhole attacks, to get a reverse shell if they're able to exploit a vulnerability. Once they get a reverse shell, to then privilege escalate. Or if they have credentials already, to make use of other methods such as PSExec, fundamentally with the Metasploit module, to return to shell. They've had 12 years to develop these techniques. This is another technique, though. As I mentioned, XP Service Pack 3 was intended to patch the AT vulnerability that allowed privilege escalation from a user credential. Here I'm going to demonstrate two things. First, the actual AT privilege escalation, and then secondly, I'm going to show basically what is fundamentally a DACLs exploit through existing PIDs with a simple utility that one of my colleagues, Derek Soto, wrote, and show that in fact it's still possible, because the AT patch was just a patch. It's still possible to escalate privileges in Windows XP. So here, what has happened is the code that tries the scheduler attack executes to return a shell. Should return here momentarily. And once that's returned, you see it's actually got a network service profile, which is a super user profile for network services in Windows domains. And that allows you to do a variety of things to collect information, such as the netshell dumps that are very popular techniques used for reconnaissance by attackers. Then next to the AT attack itself, a DACL's discovery and exploitation to create a service that launches with superuser privileges is demonstrated here. And so the AT job actually, as you saw, had a superuser system credential for the job, so that when the shell actually opens, it's going to have that service credential. So here we have a network service credential, and this allows then a service to be instantiated to perform things like reverse proxy, for example. So here I'm setting up a reverse proxy using a relatively well-known tool that has been popular with certain campaigns out of the Far East to actually generate a reverse proxy available for connection. It will instantiate here in a second. Again, this is recorded and will be available very shortly if you want to replay or screen capture anything from it. And we're nearly there. There we go. So here we've got now a reverse proxy that's available to be hit and connected to, that provides fundamentally a backdoor to the system. It's not malware, by the way. It's not malicious software. It's really just fundamentally a remote access tool like a PSExec or a netcat that's been configured in a malicious manner. I mentioned discretionary ACLs. This is a screen you might like to actually capture. You can use this DACL check script that I've got here to identify services that have privileges that can be exploited to escalate to higher level services. Unfortunately, and as I mentioned before, very often software that's installed on XP systems is installed without good access control limitations. And in this case, you see that McAfee AV was actually installed on an XP system, and it was installed with a discretionary ACL that was vulnerable to exploit. And it's not only McAfee that this happens with. Office, a variety of other applications, third-party applications, particularly ICS and BMS, Building Management System software, that control those extended assets and resources of the organization for production and logistics management. Those are commonly installed, unfortunately, with higher level privileges than they should be. For memory attacks, just a few things. There are fundamentally two types of memory attacks. One is a credential stealer. In this case, XP is often, for whatever reason, still continues to use LSAS for credential authentication. The other is a stack attack to insert and execute code into the stack, because, as I mentioned, there's not effective randomization in the stack in XP. I'm going to make a blatant product pitch here. I apologize if you don't like it. You can see here that, fortunately for XP, our product Protect actually will detect both of these types of attacks in memory to prevent exploits such as a Metasploit and malware that attempt to leverage those techniques. I mentioned in the three ways that an XP system can be attacked, you've got the memory exploit, as described here. The second is a file drop. File droppers fundamentally occur from a user behavior. A user gets an email, a phishing email, that asks them to click or download or open something that then drops a utility that has a self-installer, often by exploiting either a weak DACL on the system or, more commonly, exploiting a weakness in either the email client or an internet browser or an associated application like a PDF document or a Excel or Word document. And this is called a dropper, so it leverages exploits to compromise existing vulnerabilities and then installs a backdoor. Droppers are really pretty easy to identify in XP, fundamentally because they're a user behavior that causes them. Their discovery will be in user space, which is most commonly the user local settings temp folder. Anytime you see an executable in the user's local setting temp or application data folder, it's a good idea to take a close look at that executable and to associate it to any existing communicating processes through things like a netstat by matching the PID to the task list to see if that executable is being used in a process that is communicating. Typically, you only want to see communicating services from a very restricted set that's in the operating system, configured as a standard activity of the organization and not as an independent anomaly of any unique system. We'll talk about compromise assessment in a few minutes. Similarly, XP, it's relatively easy to identify backdoor rats. Backdoors are created when a file dropper causes the download and installation or instantiation for persistence of another binary that allows a remote access and management of the system. So these are typically called backdoor rats or just generally backdoors. Now these can be both legitimate tools like a netcat or a PSExec or the HSPVI that I showed earlier, or even RDP configurations, or they can be malicious rats that are designed with custom purposes, encryption and obfuscation techniques to assist the first parties that have an interest in actually either conducting sabotage or stealing information from a target system. Backdoor rats are relatively easy in XP to identify. They've got certain characteristics. First and foremost, they have to communicate. So looking for communicating processes and anomalous modules supporting, in particular, the SVC host process or Internet Explorer or similar processes is usually a giveaway in XP, particularly if the second factor appears. Backdoor rats need to have joint use of the user space or user experience and the kernel space or operating system. And so typically they're going to be installed in an operating system privileged location, which in Windows XP is System 32 under Windows. Attackers typically don't create a cache copy of their backdoor dropper, I'm sorry, not dropper, backdoor rat, and so these will be unique instance or single instances that are not copied into cache folders as well. Also, the third factor of a rat is that it needs persistence, and persistence, there are a limited number of ways and locations for persistence to be maintained in XP. First, of course, is the startup folders. Second is a program folder. Third is a run key in the registry, either a global run key or a user space run key. And then more commonly with backdoor services, because they need that operating system interaction, are the service keys themselves under the net services, because, again, a rat has to communicate. Now, backdoor rats typically will mimic a legitimate service name, but are most commonly named something different with some minor change to the naming convention. So as I mentioned, backdoor rats, they're backdoor services that provide remote administrative tools to access. They must transition between user and kernel space. They must persist, and they must communicate. There are relatively few attributes that need to be reviewed to identify backdoor rats in XP. It's a pretty open operating platform. And importantly, rats are not always malware. Another architectural weakness in XP is what we call path hijacking or piggybacking. And in this example, I'm going to show that using a utility, in this case I'm going to use Portmon, and I'm going to instantiate it simply by calling it a standard Windows DLL name. I'm sorry, I'm going to actually instantiate a malicious DLL with the standard Windows DLL name, WS232, which is one of the Net API DLLs. And I'm going to co-locate it with Portmon so that when Portmon, which requires that Net API DLL, when it launches on a scheduled task, it will cause a piggyback launch of this malware. And that's because in Windows XP, the call for supporting modules, the DLLs, that then in turn call API functionality from the operating system, first it looks for that file locally. If it's not there, then it looks to the path for the system call. So this is a very common technique that we see used where a seemingly legitimate file name that is in fact rat functionality is co-located with a legitimate tool like a Portmon or a Galaxy Backup or a RDP, MSTSC, or VNC utility, etc. So that when they launch, one of the calls that they require is the Net API DLL functionality. So we'll often see that API functionality being replaced with malicious utility, as in this case. So here I show that imitating an attacker, the malicious tool was renamed to WS232, dropped in next to the Portmon utility, and then a scheduled task for persistence was created that will actually launch, and in doing so will create a backdoor accessible remote administrative session. And yes, it is that simple. So here you see that Portmon was instantiated. I'm going to enumerate it next here in the Process Explorer and also the NetStat. You can see there's several instances of WS232. One of those is actually the illegitimate instance. Jump past this in the interest of time. Basically, what is going to occur is a netstat and a task list will then verify that, in fact, the RAT service was instantiated through the use of that DLL name through co-location or piggybacking with the Portmon, which is a legitimate utility, in order to create an accessible remote administration session. So going down here, you'll see the Portmon process is active as a service under PID 1380. And you'll actually see there's two instances of WS232. And that's because actually the RAT utility itself needs the Net API functionality from the kernel. And so it in turn is calling those APIs from that DLL using the path. And here you see the 6519 address. That's actually that RAT DLL communicating that it's accessible for remote access. So XP has some file system architectural weaknesses as well. In this case, it's a weakness called the unquoted paths vulnerability. This is somewhat an intrinsic issue, and it's difficult, it's very subtle to identify in an auditing procedure. Because as you can see here, in this AT job, there is a command line that appears to be legitimate, calling Adobe Reader AcroRead32exe from a legitimate path. But what you notice is there's no quotes on this. And in XP, unfortunately, because of the unquoted paths vulnerability, what's going to happen is XP is going, when this initiates, it's going to look for, instead of AcroRead32.exe, it's actually going to look for an executable called program.exe, which, as it turns out, is in the root of the C file system. So here you see program.exe. So the AT job is calling what appears to be a legitimate call for AcroRead32 to instantiate. But in fact, it's actually launching what in this case is Portmon that I renamed as program.exe in the root. And again, yes, folks, it's that easy. So let's talk for just a moment about risks and threats. There's a lot of emphasis in the press and from different security providers to call cyber tools and cyber behaviors threats. It's not really fair. Netcat isn't always malicious, nor is it always a legitimate tool. Risks are the tools that are used and how they're used. They're indicators of compromise that can give you an opportunity to assess whether they're being used in behaviors that threaten the business. Threats are behaviors that are activities that are illegitimate, policy violations, or actually malicious in nature, intended to sabotage or at least interrupt the business. So some of the behaviors to look for to identify threats to communicate to an organization are the anomalous user profile behavior. This, in fact, out of well over 100 incident responses with Fortune 500 companies around the world, this has proven, in my experience, to be the very best indicator of APT, Advanced Persistent Threat Activity. It's much, much better than simply looking for tools like Backdoor Rats or droppers. The tools, first of all, will always be an anomaly, whereas the user profile, propagation across the environment, and the use itself will demonstrate to some degree the intent of the attack behavior and the duration of the access, as well as other points of access and egress that don't utilize malware that could be recognized with other security tools. So it's important to look for both risks by their indicators of compromise, traditional blacklist and whitelist, and leveraging advanced technologies, including Cylance Protect, which really is the most advanced method of identifying malware that exists today, because it's not subject to human interpretation, it's machine learning. And it's also critically important in an incident response and an investigation to focus on the behaviors themselves, to understand what tools were used, how they were used, when, and to draw a line between the malicious tools and the tools that belong to the organization that are being used maliciously. Some indicators that are fairly common and relatively easy to look for are those anomalies in Windows build that indicate backdoor rats. As I mentioned, user abuse, the propagation of user profiles at illegitimate times or anomalous times, and by use patterns that are inconsistent with the other use of the system. A fundamental question to ask yourself: you have a laptop, likely, or at least a desktop, has your user profile on it. How many other computers in your organization have your user profile on them? That's a really simple way to determine if your profile has been hijacked. Lateral movement indicators are using tools like RDP, VNC, or other tools like Netcat, etc., and looking for the residue that they create, the files and the execution residue that they create in the file system. and then looking for indications or attributes of data exfiltration. The use, for example, of RAR when WinRAR already exists, the creation of multi-part files, and the use of the recycler folder as a storage location. Look for anomalies that demonstrate behaviors that represent potential threats to your business. In the context of security, it's important to recognize it's an evolution, a constant evolution of conducting assessments, detecting anomalies, responding to those anomalies through investigations and forensics, creating deterrence by dropping in honeypots and sinkholes and things like that, and maybe even poison pills or false flags, and then using that background intelligence to design a more secure architecture. So constantly evolving your architecture to respond to the demonstrated threat behaviors and the discovered risk indicators, like the tools that are being used and the residue that they leave. So you effectively end up with a build that is more secure. Some countermeasures to focus on in XP. The registry is a great place to start. There are only, as we talked about before, a remote administrative tool has certain characteristics. One of those characteristics is it needs persistence in order to be accessible by a remote user. So there are only a certain limited number of persistence methods available in the registry. Fundamentally, it's going to be either a global or a user run key, or more commonly, because one of the second characteristics required of a RAT is the kernel interaction. More often, you'll actually find a RAT installed under the net services DLLs, of which in XP there are only 44 legitimate DLL names. So it's relatively easy to build an auditing whitelist, or even a GPO policy in Windows to identify any anomalies from that just by the name and the key, or the creation of a new service DLL associated to a service. DNS, it's useful to utilize not just blacklists on the perimeter, but also to implement sinkholes in order to, particularly when you're provided with intelligence either from your IDS or an external provider, or you discover it internally, you can use a DNS sinkhole to very quickly identify the scope of the systems that are subject to subsequent analysis and investigation. It's useful on the network as a countermeasure to actually create an alert for endpoint-initiated RDP and VNC sessions. That can be as simple as alerting the creation of a prefetch. Windows XP, by default, records prefetch entries. And so looking for any prefetches created with a VNC executable or an MSTSC, or RDP also creates a bitmap cache file under a user profile, which will also then tell you additionally the user profile that's being used to launch remote terminal sessions from a host. Those are great alerting countermeasures, and they're very infrequent in an enterprise because typically only administrators or help desk are going to be using those tools to navigate around the environment. And so they should always appear from relatively few administration endpoints. So the anomalous use of remote access tools like RDP, VNC, Netcat, etc., are useful as alerting mechanisms to include in your countermeasures for process controls. There are some others here: multi-part RAR file creations, alerts for inconsistent data packers like 7Z and RAR, etc., in the Windows environment are useful alerts. And then things like whitelisting service binaries, alerting service stop changes, and so on. These are all countermeasure activities that you can either block, alert, or at least monitor that can help you understand the scope of an incident very quickly and identify the systems, consequently, that need to have a more significant investigation done. Some basic Windows tips for XP. Services are prescribed in XP, so it's useful to articulate from your host with a GPO query or a Altiris query or whatever what the service prescriptions are, and then simply do a frequency analysis to see what are the low frequency services that have been prescribed and to which systems. It may be worth taking another look at those systems that have anomalous services prescribed. There are a qualified set of service binaries, as I mentioned. They're in the control sets, and again, it's useful to do a periodic audit and look for anomalies in order to understand the scope of illegitimate or at least anomalous binaries in use. And then to periodically assess, hopefully with alerting mechanisms, the persistence mechanisms that are limited in Windows XP. So some recommendations around XP for prevention of attacks, or at least some level of control. Detect the risks, those tools and other indicators of compromise with a technology like Cylance Protect. Cylance Protect will help you identify in-memory attempts to execute arbitrary code or to drop files that will then attempt to exploit vulnerabilities. Assess the risks according to their use or the possible impact, if they're used, on the business. And for that, you want to do what we call a compromise assessment using a platform like our analytics platform, Response Cat. And then detect the threats, those behavioral activities, through analysis with a more structured forensic process and procedure. But more fundamentally, it's useful to audit to know your build through high and low frequency in order to define baselines, both on the build as well as the network, as well as your user activities. People, process, and technology is what it comes down to. And then really critically important in the whole span of this is to communicate the threats for organizational resolution. Malware is sensational. The tools that are used are sensational. They're interesting to the tech community, but they don't mean much to a CFO who's writing a check to help you build a preventative architecture, or writing another check to help you handle an incident. So communicate in the context of the organizational stakeholders, the threats that impact the business by behaviors, rather than simply focusing on the tools that were used. We have a platform that can help with that analysis. It's called the Compromise Assessment Tool. And it quickly identifies and categorizes and differentiates the threat behaviors from the risk indicators and tools that are used, and helps to prioritize the response and the perception of the risks and threats, both by risk category as well as by the severity of the related findings. So there are some usual things that you'll hear from every security professional, of course. Patch immediately. That may not be possible. Configure systems with least privilege. That is always possible. And limit user privileges. Absolutely. Unfortunately, depending on the software that you're running that is causing you to retain the use of XP, you may be limited to some extent in what you can do with that system, which may mean that you need to build additional firewalls around those particular systems. Remove administrative shares where it's possible, and then use associated whitelisting, blacklisting, and disable the unnecessary services, etc. But we recognize that sometimes these general recommendations are not really realistic in every environment. Fundamentally, to manage your risk with XP, at some point you're going to need to upgrade. And that's because of the lack of those controls that help you randomize the heap, that help you control the privileged access to systems between the user experience and the operating system, and that help you gain critical awareness of your build and deficiencies, both in the build as well as the way it's managed and used in your environment. So I'm going to open it up for questions. I apologize, I went a few minutes longer than I had hoped I would, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have. And you can also contact me at the email below or the info at Cylance if you want information from more than just me. What you recommend to lock down on XP? Fundamentally, it's useful to use that DACL script, the discretionary ACL script, to check for any vulnerable services that could allow a privilege exploit. I'd recommend that you certainly review the software that's installed on XP to determine if it's being given too many privileges for access, because the binary that supports that process of the software could be in turn hijacked to escalate or impersonate a privilege across the network. Unfortunately, in XP, applications are often installed with administrative rights, or at least superuser rights, and those rights are commonly impersonated to gain lateral movement in an environment. So I definitely recommend that you lock down the ACLs around the applications used in XP. Next to that, I also recommend that you lock down any unnecessary services. You can do that with GPO. If there's no reason to have FTP or Telnet or other services available on the system, you can put GPO controls in place to block their use. I at least recommend that you put in controls to monitor and alert things like new account creation on a system. It's not that much information in an organization. It's incredibly helpful in the face of an incident to be able to quickly review what credentials have been created on what system and at what time, and how they moved laterally in an environment.
Okay, it looks about it. Again, we've gone a little bit over time here, so for the sake of getting everybody out of the webcast, if you have any additional questions, feel free to email Shane. As you see, his email address is on the screen, or you can always email us at info@cylance.com. If you'd like to get a customizable demo, or rather a live demonstration of Cylance Protect, go ahead and email us at sales@cylance.com or any of those other email addresses that you see. You can also call us directly at 1-877-973-3336. If you look in the chat window, there's actually a link to a new XP security guide that is a lot of the information that Shane has gone over on the webinar itself is available there. So click through, download that guide, and get to securing XP in your organization today. This webinar will be recorded and posted on our site within about 24 hours, and you can also follow us on YouTube and subscribe to our channel. It's just Cylance Inc. If you search for Cylance Inc., you'll find us. And you can actually subscribe and get all the updates for the videos that we do post. And just a reminder, follow us at Twitter at Cylance Inc. For all the latest news and updates. And so with that, we'll let you guys go. I'd like to thank Dr. Shane Shook today, and I hope everybody has a great day. Thanks again for joining us.